For more than 80 years, Harlem has told a story that Lucky Luciano sent 6 men to eliminate Bumpy Johnson, and that none of them ever returned. No police report confirms it. No newspaper recorded it. But the legend survived anyway, passed down through barbershops and church basements, and old men who swore they knew someone who was there. Nobody can hand you a police report with 6 names on it. Nobody can point to a headline from 1939 announcing a massacre by the river. But the story survived anyway, carried by word of mouth long after the people who lived it were gone, and the reason it survived is worth understanding before we get into what may have actually happened. This is the legend as it has been passed down, alongside what the historical record can and cannot confirm. Stories like this one are common in the history of American organized crime, more common than most people realize. The entire world of Prohibition-era and post-Prohibition gangland New York operated almost completely outside official documentation. Men disappeared, and nobody filed a missing persons report. Because filing one meant admitting you knew a man who traveled in circles nobody wanted to explain to a police detective. Bodies were weighted and dropped into rivers, buried in construction sites, or left in places where the message would be understood by the people who needed to understand it, without ever becoming a story the daily papers could print. Because of this, much of what we know about organized crime in this period comes not from courtrooms and evidence lockers, but from later testimony, from memoirs written decades afterward, from journalists piecing together fragments long after the fact, and from the oral traditions of the neighborhoods where these events actually happened. Harlem's oral tradition around Bumpy Johnson is one of the richest examples of this kind of history, and it deserves the same careful treatment historians apply to any other source, paired with honesty about its limitations. To understand why a story like this could take root at all, you have to understand what New York looked like in 1939, and you have to understand 2 men who never should have crossed paths but somehow did anyway. New York in this period was a city recovering slowly from the Depression, still carrying the scars of Prohibition's collapse, and increasingly aware that a Second World War was building overseas, even as most Americans hoped it would stay there. Organized crime had adapted quickly to the end of Prohibition, shifting its revenue base from bootlegging toward gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and narcotics, industries that required less overt violence to sustain, but demanded the same underlying territorial control that had defined the bootlegging years. It was into this shifting, adapting underworld that the tension between Luciano's downtown organization and Johnson's Harlem operation took shape, a tension rooted less in old grudges than in a changing criminal economy, where every operator was recalculating what territory was worth fighting for and what territory was better left alone. The first man was Charles Luciano, known to almost everyone as Lucky, a nickname that came either from a card game or a beating he survived, depending on which version of his life you believe. By 1939, Luciano was already a legend in the underworld, though not the kind of legend that came with freedom. 3 years earlier, in 1936, an ambitious prosecutor named Thomas Dewey had convicted Luciano on 62 counts related to compulsory prostitution, a conviction many historians and even some contemporaries considered shaky, built on testimony from witnesses with every incentive to lie to save themselves. Guilty or not, Luciano was sentenced to 30 to 50 years and shipped upstate to Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, a prison so far north and so cold that inmates called it Little Siberia. What made Luciano remarkable wasn't the sentence. Plenty of gangsters went to prison and simply stopped mattering. What made Luciano remarkable was that he didn't stop. From behind those walls, through lawyers, through visitors, through a system of coded messages and trusted intermediaries, Luciano kept a hand on the organization he had spent the better part of 2 decades building. He had been the architect of something bigger than any single gang. Rather than one family trying to dominate the entire city and getting torn apart in the process, the way things had gone during the bloody Castellamarese War earlier in the decade, Luciano helped build a commission, a governing body where the major crime families divided territory, settled disputes, and avoided the kind of open warfare that brought police and headlines down on everybody. It was, in its own dark way, a system built on order. And Luciano, even in a cell, remained one of its architects. That system had not come easily. The Castellamarese War of the early 1930s had pitted two old guard Sicilian bosses against each other in a conflict that dragged on for years and cost dozens of lives on both sides. A war fought largely over the old world hierarchies and rivalries that men like Luciano considered outdated and, more importantly, bad for business. Luciano had come up on the losing side of neither faction exactly, positioning himself as a younger, more pragmatic operator who understood that ethnic loyalty mattered less than efficient revenue. When the dust settled and both old bosses were dead, one killed in an ambush that some accounts suggest Luciano himself helped arrange, he emerged as the figure best positioned to reorganize the city's criminal underworld along entirely new lines. Instead of a single all-powerful boss ruling through fear and constant internal betrayal, Luciano helped establish a ruling council made up of the heads of what became known as the Five Families, along with representatives from major Jewish and other ethnic operations that controlled significant pieces of the city's illegal economy. This commission functioned almost like a board of directors, meeting periodically to settle territorial disputes, approve major decisions, and, when necessary, authorize the kind of violence that kept the whole system running smoothly rather than descending into the chaos of the war that had just ended. It was a genuinely innovative piece of criminal organization, one that outlasted Luciano himself by decades, and understanding it matters because it explains exactly why an independent operation like Bumpy Johnson's in Harlem represented such a philosophical problem and not merely a financial one. Harlem wasn't just money the commission wasn't collecting, it was a visible exception to a rule that depended on having no visible exceptions. The second man was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, called Bumpy because of a bump on the back of his skull. A man who had come to New York from South Carolina as a teenager and built himself, piece by piece, into the most respected figure in Harlem's underworld. Johnson had been born in Charleston in the early years of the 20th century, into a black family navigating the particular dangers of the Jim Crow South, where a wrong word to the wrong white man could end in a lynching that no court would ever prosecute. Accounts of his childhood describe a family that had already been marked by racial violence before Johnson ever left the state, and by the time he was sent north to live with relatives in Harlem as a young teenager, he arrived already carrying a wariness of authority and a determination that nobody would ever again decide his fate for him because of the color of his skin. Harlem in the 1920s was in the middle of its own cultural flowering, filled with music, literature, and ambition. But it was also a place where opportunity for young black men outside the arts remained narrow, and Johnson found his opening in the streets rather than the salons, working his way up through petty theft and street hustling, before finding steadier and more lucrative work in the world of illegal gambling that was already deeply woven into Harlem's economy. By the late 1930s, Johnson controlled a significant share of Harlem's policy banks, the illegal lottery system built on three-digit numbers that ordinary people played for pennies in hopes of a payout that could change their week, if not their life. Policy wasn't just gambling to the people who ran it and played it. It was one of the only paths to real money available to black entrepreneurs and workers who were locked out of legitimate banks, legitimate insurance, and legitimate credit in a city that segregated opportunity as thoroughly as it segregated neighborhoods. A resident could put down a nickel or a dime on a number pulled from a formula tied to public figures like the daily stock market totals or racetrack results, numbers that felt random enough to be fair and public enough that nobody could easily rig them without getting caught by the neighborhood's own scrutiny. A winning combination could pay out at odds of 500 to 1, turning a spare quarter into rent money or turning a modest weekly wager into the difference between a family eating well or eating poorly. Whoever controlled policy in Harlem controlled an economic engine that ran on hope and touched nearly every family in the neighborhood, and the banks that ran the operation, taking in thousands of small bets a day and paying out the occasional large win, generated profits that rivaled any legitimate business operating above 110th Street. Johnson hadn't built this position from nothing. He had learned the trade under Stephanie St. Clair, a formidable woman known as Madam Queen, who had run Harlem's numbers rackets through the early 1930s, with a combination of business sense and sheer nerve that made her one of the only black operators in the city who could stand toe-to-toe with the Italian and Jewish syndicates downtown. St. Clair had arrived in New York from the French Caribbean, built a policy operation almost from scratch, and defended it through sheer force of will and a well-placed network of lawyers and bribed officials, becoming one of the wealthiest and most independent black women in the city, during an era when that combination was almost unheard of. Johnson worked as her enforcer and close associate, learning directly from her the delicate balance between violence, business acumen, and community relationships that running a policy empire required. St. Clair's operation had survived an attempted takeover by Dutch Schultz, the Bronx beer baron turned numbers king, who tried to muscle into Harlem in the early 1930s, using violence, intimidation, and outright murder against black operators who refused to fall in line. Schultz had grown rich running beer during Prohibition, and when Prohibition ended and that revenue dried up, he looked at Harlem's booming policy business and decided it belonged to him rather than to the black bankers who had built it. His methods were brutal even by Underworld standards of the time. Operators who refused to sell out or pay tribute were beaten, kidnapped, or killed, and for a period in the early 1930s, it looked as though Schultz might succeed in taking the entire Harlem numbers racket by force, the same way downtown gangs had absorbed most other illegal enterprises across the city. St. Clair fought back with everything she had, including reportedly cooperating with law enforcement and tax investigators to make Schultz's operation as costly and exposed as possible, a tactic that Johnson would later echo in his own conflicts with the downtown families. Schultz's war on Harlem policy was brutal, and it very nearly worked. It was ended not by Harlem alone, but by circumstance. In 1935, Schultz was gunned down in a Newark chop house, reportedly on orders from the commission itself, which had grown tired of the heat his war on Harlem, his reckless public behavior, and his feud with prosecutor Thomas Dewey were bringing down on organized crime citywide. The commission, in other words, killed one of its own, rather than let his uncontrolled ambition keep drawing federal and state attention to an underworld that depended on staying out of the spotlight. With Schultz gone and St. Clair moving toward retirement, the man who filled the vacuum was Bumpy Johnson, her former enforcer, a man who had watched an outside invasion nearly destroy Harlem's black-run policy business, and had drawn a hard lesson from it. Harlem would defend what belonged to Harlem, and it would not do so quietly. By 1939, this arrangement mostly held, if only because the deaths of the Schultz War and the subsequent commission crackdown had left everyone exhausted and wary of repeating it. The 5 families that made up the commission largely left Harlem alone, taking a hands-off approach to a neighborhood that had already proven costly to invade once. But hands-off did not mean forgotten, and it did not mean respected as an equal. To men like Luciano, even from behind bars, Harlem represented an irritation, a loose thread in an otherwise carefully organized city. Every other neighborhood paid tribute in one form or another. Every other operator answered, directly or indirectly, to the commission's authority. Harlem, under Johnson, increasingly did not. According to the version of events that has circulated for decades in Harlem oral history, word reached Luciano through his lieutenants that Johnson's operation had grown large enough and independent enough that it could no longer be ignored. The concern wasn't only about money, though the money mattered. Harlem's policy banks were pulling in enormous sums each week, money that flowed entirely within the neighborhood and touched none of the downtown families' pockets. To put that money in perspective, a single well-run policy bank in this era could clear several $1,000s in profit every week, even after paying out winners, at a time when a factory worker's weekly wage might amount to $20 or $30. Across the dozens of individual banks that made up Harlem's numbers economy, the aggregate sums moving through the neighborhood each month rivaled the revenue of entire legitimate industries, and virtually none of it was reaching the commission's own coffers or being taxed through the elaborate system of tribute payments that kept the 5 families' peace intact everywhere else in the city. The deeper concern, as the story goes, was precedent. If a black-run operation in Harlem could hold a piece of New York's underworld economy without paying tribute to the commission, other operators across the city, other ethnic enclaves chafing under Italian and Jewish dominance, might start asking why they were still paying at all. The whole architecture Luciano had helped design, depended on the appearance that there was no alternative to falling in line. Johnson, whether he intended it or not, had become living proof that there was. The story continues that Luciano first tried the same approach the Commission had tried with other independent operators before turning to violence, incorporation rather than elimination. A message was carried upstate and then carried back down, proposing that Johnson accept a downtown partner, share a portion of his profits, and in exchange receive the protection and legitimacy that came with Commission backing. This was, in theory, a generous offer by Underworld standards. It would have shielded Johnson's operation from police pressure and from any other outside gang eyeing Harlem's money. Johnson is said to have listened to the proposal without much visible reaction and answered it the same way he answered most things that mattered to him, briefly and without room for negotiation. Harlem, he reportedly said, had already buried one outsider who thought he could walk in and take what belonged to the neighborhood, and Harlem would bury as many more as it took. According to the version of the story that circulated most widely, the man who carried this first proposal to Johnson was someone chosen carefully, a figure with connections on both sides of the color line who could move through Harlem without drawing suspicion, and who had a working relationship with Johnson from earlier, smaller dealings. He is said to have delivered the offer over a quiet dinner rather than a street corner meeting, treating the conversation with the kind of formality that reflected how seriously the Commission wanted the matter handled. Johnson, according to this telling, let the man finish his entire presentation without interruption, nodding occasionally, asking no questions, giving no indication of his eventual answer until the very end. This kind of patience is described consistently across different versions of the story as characteristic of Johnson's temperament, a deliberate contrast to the reputation for hot-tempered violence that the era's newspapers and later films often assigned to organized crime figures generally. Johnson's power, in the versions of this story that Harlem told about itself, came precisely from that patience, from a refusal to be rushed or provoked into a response before he had fully considered his position. When the answer came, it was delivered without theatrics, according to every version of the account. There was no shouting, no visible anger, nothing that gave the messenger an opening to argue or negotiate further. Johnson is said to have simply restated his position and then changed the subject to something else entirely, a signal that the conversation, as far as he was concerned, was already finished. The messenger reportedly returned downtown that same night and delivered the answer to intermediaries who would carry it back upstate to Dannemora. And it is at that point, according to the story, that the tone of the conflict shifted from negotiation to something with much higher stakes. Whether those exact words were ever spoken is impossible to verify. What can be said with more confidence is that this kind of blunt defiance fit everything else historians and contemporaries recorded about Johnson's character. He was, by every account that survives him, a man allergic to being told what to do, someone who had spent a childhood and young adulthood watching outsiders extract value from Harlem while giving nothing back, and someone who had decided early that he would rather risk everything than accept a smaller share of something that was already his. According to the oral tradition, that answer travelled back upstate to Dannemora, and, according to the legend, Luciano decided upon hearing it that the conversation was finished. The legend says he gave the order to handle the Johnson situation permanently, not as a message or a warning shot, but as a final resolution. The legend says 6 men were selected for the job, experienced operators from the Lower East Side, chosen for a reputation of handling this kind of work cleanly, without loose ends and without drawing attention. Their instructions, as the story is told, were simple. Locate Johnson somewhere removed from Harlem's crowded streets, somewhere without the density of witnesses that made an open killing in the neighborhood too risky, and finish the matter there. Choosing a crew for a job like this, in the world these men operated in, was itself a careful process that reflected how seriously the assignment was taken. A boss did not send inexperienced men after a target as well protected and well informed as Johnson was understood to be, even by outsiders who had never operated in Harlem themselves. The men selected, according to the story, had reputations built on other jobs handled quietly across the city in the years leading up to 1939, work that never made headlines precisely because it had been done competently. That such a crew could be assembled, dispatched, and apparently lost entirely in a single night says as much about the story's underlying logic as any other detail within it. It was not a story about amateurs stumbling into an ambush. It was a story about professionals walking into a trap set by someone who had outplanned them at their own game, which is part of what made the tale worth telling and retelling in the years that followed. It's worth pausing here to note what we actually know for certain from the historical record, separate from the version passed down through generations of Harlem storytelling. We know Luciano was incarcerated at this time and continued directing organized crime affairs from prison, a fact confirmed by multiple sources, including his eventual cooperation with naval intelligence during the war and his deportation to Italy in 1946. Dannemora itself, despite its remote location and reputation for harsh conditions, was not the kind of total isolation the state might have hoped for when it sent Luciano there. Wealthy and connected inmates in this era routinely found ways to maintain outside influence, through cooperative guards who could be paid, through attorneys who visited under the cover of legal business and carried messages alongside legal paperwork, and through a prison mail and visitation system that was simply not designed to stop a man with Luciano's resources and connections from continuing to run a criminal enterprise. Multiple biographers and journalists who later investigated Luciano's imprisonment documented this pattern in detail, describing a network of visitors and communications that allowed him to remain an active decision-maker in commission affairs throughout his years upstate, right up until his transfer to a different facility and his eventual wartime cooperation arrangement. Whatever specific instructions Luciano may or may not have given regarding Johnson, the broader claim that he continued directing significant organizational decisions from behind bars during this period is well supported by the historical record. We know Bumpy Johnson controlled significant Harlem numbers operations by the late 1930s and maintained that control for years without the kind of large-scale outside interference that had defined the Schultz era. We know Harlem in this period developed a reputation among downtown crime figures as dangerous and unprofitable territory to invade, a reputation that historians attribute partly to community solidarity and partly to Johnson's own network of loyalty and information. What we do not have is a documented police report, court record, or contemporary news account describing a specific six-man hit squad or a specific warehouse confrontation in 1939. The particulars of that night, if it happened at all in the form the story describes, live in the space between documented history and neighborhood legend, the same space that holds countless underworld stories from an era when victims simply vanished and nobody filed a report because nobody involved wanted police attention in the first place. With that context in place, here is the story as it has been told and retold, understood as folklore built around a real conflict between real historical figures rather than as a verified sequence of events. The warehouse the crew is said to have chosen sat near the East River, a leftover from the Prohibition years when liquor still moved through the city in crates marked as something else entirely. Johnson reportedly used the building to store goods and settle accounts with a supplier on a predictable schedule, visiting on a set night each week, a habit that made him easier to track than he might have liked. Predictability was the one weakness even the most careful operators struggled to eliminate, because business required some degree of routine, and routine was exactly what an assassin needed to plan around. The building itself, as it has been described in the retellings, was a squat brick structure a few blocks removed from the busier stretches of the waterfront, the kind of place that drew no attention during the day and emptied once the last dock workers went home for the night, leaving only the sound of water against the pilings and the occasional passing car to break the silence. The location itself made a certain kind of sense for the job the crew had been given. Unlike Harlem's streets, which were crowded even late at night and populated by residents who noticed unfamiliar faces immediately, the docklands along the East River emptied after dark. A killing there could happen quietly, without the crowd of witnesses that made a hit inside Harlem itself too dangerous to attempt. The 6 men chosen for the job, according to the accounts that have circulated, were not the kind of low-level muscle used for simple collections or minor disputes. They were said to be seasoned operators, men who had already built reputations for handling difficult assignments without leaving a trail. the sort of crew a boss called on when a job needed to disappear as completely as its target. Whether their names were ever recorded anywhere is unknown, and no surviving document offers even a partial roster, which is itself unsurprising, given how thoroughly this kind of assignment was designed to leave nothing behind. What the crew is said not to have accounted for was the depth of Johnson's own information network, something he had built deliberately in the years after watching Schultz's war nearly destroy everything St. Clair had built. Johnson trusted very few people completely, but he had spent years cultivating a web of small relationships, corrupt patrolmen who owed him favors, bartenders who repeated what they overheard, and, according to the most enduring version of the story, a teenage runner who spent his afternoons around the downtown docks, listening to conversations nobody expected a kid to understand. That boy is said to have overheard two unfamiliar men discussing a warehouse and a Tuesday night, and to have run the distance back to Harlem to deliver the warning before the meeting could take place. This kind of network, built from dozens of small, low-cost relationships rather than a handful of expensive, high-level connections, is precisely the intelligence advantage that historians point to when explaining how Harlem's underworld consistently outmaneuvered outside incursions despite having far less money and far fewer guns than the downtown organizations trying to move in. A single corrupt police captain on a mob payroll could be neutralized by a rival bribe or a leaked piece of information. A network of dozens of bartenders, doormen, cab drivers, newsboys, and neighborhood children scattered across the city, each aware of only a small piece of the picture and each loyal for reasons ranging from money to genuine community feeling, was nearly impossible for an outside organization to fully map or compromise. Johnson is widely credited, both in serious historical accounts and in the oral tradition, with understanding this principle better than almost anyone else operating in New York's underworld during this period. And it is precisely the kind of advantage that would make a story like the warehouse ambush plausible even to those who cannot verify its specific details. Rather than cancel his plans and go into hiding, which might have only delayed the inevitable, Johnson is said to have decided the safer move was to control the encounter rather than avoid it. If 6 men were coming to kill him in a place he already knew intimately, he could turn that familiarity into an advantage. This decision, as it has been described across different tellings of the story, reflected a broader philosophy that Johnson is consistently credited with holding throughout his career. Simply avoiding a threat rarely eliminates it. A crew that failed once could return a second time, better prepared and less predictable, having learned from whatever mistake had let their target slip away. Confronting the threat directly, on ground of his own choosing, offered the possibility of ending the matter completely rather than merely postponing it. This is the same underlying logic that, according to more thoroughly documented accounts of Johnson's later career, shaped his approach to the better recorded 1943 conflict with the Commission as well, when he again chose confrontation over retreat, at moments when a more cautious operator might have tried to negotiate from a position of weakness instead. Whether or not the specific tactical details of the 1939 warehouse story can be verified, this broader pattern of decisive, proactive response to outside threats is well supported by everything historians agree really did happen in Johnson's later, better documented conflicts, which lends the earlier story a kind of internal consistency even where direct evidence is lacking. The story holds that on the appointed Tuesday night, the 6 men arrived at the warehouse a little before 11, spreading out along the loading dock in the practiced, unhurried manner of men who had done this kind of work before, watching the access points, watching the street, waiting for a car that was supposed to deliver Johnson with at most 1 or 2 companions. The night was said to be quiet, cold enough that their breath showed in the streetlight, the kind of stillness that made men confident they had chosen their moment well. What they found instead, according to the legend, was a building that had already been quietly reoccupied hours earlier by 8 of Johnson's own men, hidden among the crates and shadows of a space they knew far better than the visitors did. When the confrontation came, the legend says it came from multiple directions at once, and that the visiting crew found itself surrounded with no clear way to respond. The fighting, according to the account, lasted only a few minutes, though those who told the story afterward described it as feeling much longer to anyone caught inside it. Some of the men are said to have gone down almost immediately, caught in positions with no real cover among the stacked crates. Others reportedly tried to fall back toward exits that had already been anticipated and blocked, discovering too late that the building they thought they understood had already been turned against them. According to the legend, the confrontation ended with the visiting crew disappearing entirely, and later versions of the story claimed that none of them survived, with one of Johnson's own men wounded but alive, a detail that later tellings of the story sometimes leave out entirely, since a story of total, costless victory travels further than one with any complication attached to it. What happened next, in the version of the story that survives, is almost as important as the confrontation itself, because it explains why the event could become legend without ever becoming a documented crime. According to the legend, Johnson made sure nothing was left behind for police to find, no scene to investigate, no names to trace back to a specific crew or a specific employer. Downtown, the story goes, all that would have been known was that 6 men sent on an assignment simply never reported back and were never seen again. A silence that in the underworld of that era could mean any number of things, none of them requiring an official explanation. That silence is precisely the kind of gap that oral history fills. Word is said to have spread anyway, not through police reports or newspapers, but through the same underworld channels that carried every rumor in that era, whispered in pool halls and barbershops and the back rooms of nightclubs from the Bronx to Brooklyn. Nobody could confirm the specifics, and nobody wanted to be the one asking too many questions about a Harlem operator who had apparently made an entire hit squad disappear. The story became useful precisely because it could not be verified. It discouraged exactly the kind of casual challenge to Johnson's territory that had proven so costly during the Schultz years, and it did so without leaving behind evidence that could be used against Johnson in court or held up as justification for a larger, more public war. There is also a practical dimension to this kind of disappearance that is worth understanding on its own terms. In a city the size of New York, even in an era before modern forensic techniques, 6 missing men working outside the law would have been difficult for any official agency to trace with confidence, especially when none of their known associates had any incentive to report them missing or to cooperate with whatever investigation might follow. Prohibition era and post-Prohibition. New York had already produced a substantial number of underworld disappearances that were never solved and, in many cases, never seriously investigated, because the victims existed largely outside the reach of institutions that might otherwise have looked for them. A story such as this one fits comfortably within that broader, well-documented pattern of underworld violence, leaving behind silence rather than evidence, which is part of why, even lacking direct documentation, the story has never struck the historians and journalists who have studied Johnson's life as implausible on its face. According to the story, Luciano received word of the crew's disappearance through the same kind of coded, careful language men used when discussing sensitive matters with someone serving 30 to 50 years, delivered through a lawyer's visit or a trusted courier, rather than anything that could be intercepted or later used as evidence. Luciano is said to have reacted with very little visible emotion, a response that those close to him understood as its own kind of signal. A boss who complained loudly about a failure was a boss trying to save face in front of subordinates who were watching to see how he handled setbacks. A boss who said almost nothing was a boss already calculating his next move, unwilling to let anyone see uncertainty. Those who have studied Luciano's temperament closely, drawing on later interviews with associates and on his own recorded reflections from his years in exile, describe a man whose greatest asset was precisely this kind of controlled patience, an ability to absorb bad news without letting it dictate an immediate, emotional response. This was, by most accounts, part of what separated Luciano from the previous generation of old-world bosses who had gone to war over insults and territorial slights, without pausing to calculate whether the fight was actually worth winning. If the warehouse story is accurate even in its broad strokes, Luciano's restrained reaction to losing 6 men in a single night would fit that established pattern precisely. A boss weighing the cost of continuing a fight against a target that had already proven far more dangerous than anticipated, rather than doubling down purely out of wounded pride. It is exactly the kind of calculation that, according to the story, ultimately led nowhere further, because the numbers simply did not favor a third attempt. But according to every account, no next move ever came, at least not in the form of another direct attempt on Johnson's life. There were practical reasons for this beyond whatever personal calculation Luciano made. By the tail end of the 1930s, Luciano's own legal situation was consuming an enormous amount of attention and resources. His lawyers were pursuing appeals that would eventually fail. His organization needed stability more than it needed an unresolved war with an uncertain outcome. And there was a broader lesson that the entire commission seemed to absorb from both the Schultz debacle earlier in the decade and, whatever happened, or was believed to have happened, with this second attempt on Johnson, Harlem was not worth the cost of taking by force. The neighborhood's tight community bonds, its residents' well-founded distrust of police, which made it harder for outside gangs to rely on the same corrupt law enforcement relationships that worked elsewhere in the city, and Johnson's own reputation as someone willing to meet violence with equal or greater violence, combined to make Harlem a poor investment for anyone calculating the potential returns against the potential losses. The ripple effects, according to the way the story has been passed down, extended well beyond Harlem itself. Other independent operators around the city, men running smaller rackets in neighborhoods the commission hadn't fully absorbed, are said to have taken quiet note of what happened when a downtown crew tried to erase a Harlem operator who refused to bend. Whether or not the specific warehouse confrontation ever occurred exactly as described, the broader pattern it represents was real and observable. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, ethnic enclaves across New York watched closely to see which neighborhoods the commission could absorb cheaply and which ones cost more than they were worth. Jewish operators in Brooklyn, Irish crews still holding pockets of the West Side, and other independent rackets around the outer boroughs all operated with an awareness of these precedents, adjusting their own posture toward the downtown families based on which challenges succeeded and which failed. A story about Harlem surviving an assassination attempt intact, however embellished it may have become with each retelling, functioned as a kind of public signal that reinforced Harlem's reputation as expensive and dangerous territory, a reputation that likely did as much to protect Johnson's operation in the years that followed as any specific act of violence could have. That reputation mattered because it changed the calculus for everyone involved. A commission that ran on rational cost-benefit thinking, the same kind of thinking that had led it to eliminate Schultz for being too costly to keep around, was unlikely to keep pouring resources into a target that had already proven expensive to move against. Every additional crew sent and lost, every additional rumor of failure that spread through the Underworld's whisper network, made the eventual math clearer. Harlem's continued independence was not, in the end, primarily a matter of official policy or commission mercy. It was a matter of accumulated cost, real or perceived, that made the alternative to leaving Johnson alone look worse than tolerating him. So the matter, as the story goes, simply went quiet. No formal truce was ever announced. No messenger arrived carrying peace terms. Harlem continued operating largely as it always had, under Johnson's control, existing at the edge of the commission's authority rather than fully inside it, a loose thread that the organization that valued order above almost everything else had decided, twice now, was not worth the effort of pulling. This pattern, an outside attempt to seize Harlem's underworld economy, met with fierce and costly resistance followed by an uneasy, undocumented peace, would repeat itself a few years later in the early 1940s, when a different and more direct challenge from the Commission tested Johnson's control over Harlem once more. That later conflict, which unfolded closer to 1943, and which is better documented in newspaper accounts, court records, and law enforcement files from the period, shares enough structural similarities with the 1939 story that some historians have wondered whether elements of the two episodes became blended over decades of retelling, with details from one era attaching themselves to the other as the story passed from person to person. This is common in oral history generally. Stories that survive by word of mouth tend to consolidate over time, combining separate incidents into a single, more dramatic narrative that is easier to remember and easier to tell. None of this means the underlying conflict between Luciano's organization and Johnson's Harlem operation was invented. The tension was real, The stakes were real. Both men were real, documented historical figures whose paths, given the geography and economics of organized crime in that era, almost certainly crossed in some fashion. What remains uncertain, and what likely will always remain uncertain given how thoroughly this world operated outside the reach of any official record, is exactly how many of the specific details, the warehouse, the 6 men, the runner boy, the precise date, reflect a single verifiable event versus a story shaped and reshaped by decades of Harlem storytelling, protective community mythology, and the natural tendency of oral history to sharpen a complicated situation into a single memorable night. What can be said with real confidence is this: whatever combination of documented fact and community legend produced this story, it reflects something historians broadly agree was true about Harlem's underworld economy in this period. Black-run policy operations in Harlem, built and defended largely by black entrepreneurs, enforcers, and community networks, proved remarkably resistant to outside takeover attempts throughout the 1930s and into the 1940s, despite operating in the shadow of a citywide criminal power structure that dominated nearly every other neighborhood in New York. Dutch Schultz tried and largely failed, at tremendous cost to everyone involved. The Luciano organization, whether through the exact sequence of events described in Harlem's oral history, or through some quieter, less dramatic process of calculation and restraint, ultimately left Johnson's operation standing, rather than absorbing it. And Bumpy Johnson himself went on to become one of the most enduring and mythologized figures in the history of American organized crime, a status built in no small part on stories exactly like this one, stories that may not survive rigorous documentary scrutiny in every detail, but that captured something true about the man's reputation and about Harlem's determination to protect what it had built. There's a broader point worth sitting with here, one that applies to almost every story that survives from this era of American organized crime. The criminal underworld of the 1930s and 1940s functioned deliberately outside official record-keeping. Killings went unreported because reporting them meant inviting police attention nobody wanted. Business deals were sealed with handshakes and threats rather than contracts. Reputations were built and destroyed through word of mouth long before anyone thought to write anything down for the historical record. This means that almost every colorful story from this period, whether about Luciano, about Johnson, about Schultz, about any of the era's major figures, exists in some blend of documented fact and community legend, and separating the two with total confidence is often simply impossible more than 80 years later. Responsible storytelling about this era means acknowledging that blend rather than presenting every dramatic detail as settled historical fact. This challenge is compounded, in Johnson's case specifically, by a further layer of historical difficulty that deserves its own mention. Much of Harlem's own history during this period was recorded, when it was recorded at all, by institutions that had little interest in preserving the internal details of black community life, with the same rigor applied to downtown, predominantly white organized crime figures. Newspapers covering Luciano's trial filled pages with courtroom testimony and our detailed biography. Newspapers covering Harlem crime, when they covered it at all, often did so briefly, dismissively, or through a lens more interested in confirming existing prejudices than documenting the internal workings of the community's underworld with any real depth. This asymmetry means that figures like Johnson, despite being every bit as consequential to New York's criminal history as any of his downtown counterparts, left behind a much thinner paper trail relative to their actual influence, and much of what survives comes instead from the community itself, preserved through oral history, later interviews conducted by researchers and journalists who took Harlem's history seriously, and the reminiscences of people who lived alongside these events and understood their significance even when official institutions did not. Any honest account of Johnson's life has to grapple with this imbalance, rather than pretend the documentary record for his life carries the same completeness as the record for a figure like Luciano. That distinction matters for another reason too. Bumpy Johnson was, without question, a criminal, someone who built his fortune through an illegal gambling operation, and who by every account was willing to use violence to defend his territory. He was also, according to extensive testimony from people who lived in Harlem during his lifetime, a man who reinvested heavily in his community, who employed hundreds of residents in a city that offered them few legitimate opportunities, who was known to help struggling families quietly, and who came to represent something more complicated than a simple gangster in the eyes of many of his neighbors. Understanding why a story like the one told here took root and endured for generations requires understanding both sides of that complexity. Harlem residents did not celebrate Johnson because they were naive about what his business represented. They celebrated the idea that their neighborhood could defend itself against outside forces that had exploited Harlem in nearly every other arena of American life, from housing to employment to policing. A story about 6 outside gunmen who came to take Harlem's money and vanished into the night was never just a story about organized crime. It was a story about a community that had very few victories to claim against the systems arrayed against it, holding on to one of the few it had. This kind of protective myth-making is not unique to Johnson, and recognizing that pattern helps put the 1939 story in proper context. Other black underworld figures of later decades, men whose stories similarly circulated through oral tradition long before any journalist or historian attempted to verify them, experienced the same process of embellishment, exaggeration, and occasional outright fabrication layered onto a real underlying career. Some of those later legends were eventually shown, under close journalistic scrutiny, to have inflated their own importance considerably beyond what the documentary record could support. This history should make any responsible storyteller cautious about presenting colorful, undocumented details as settled fact, even when those details make for a better story. It does not mean the underlying figures were unimportant or that their community's pride in them was misplaced. It means the specific claims deserve to be weighed carefully, sourced honestly, and presented with the uncertainty they actually carry, rather than flattened into simple, unqualified assertions of fact for the sake of a cleaner narrative. By the time Luciano's own story reached its final chapters, first through his continued imprisonment, then through his controversial cooperation with naval intelligence during World War II, which some historians believe helped secure his early release, and finally through his deportation to Italy in 1946, the world that had produced the conflict with Johnson had already begun changing. The commission that Luciano helped design would continue operating for decades, adapting to new leadership, new federal pressure, and new generations of bosses who inherited a structure Luciano had built, but who ran it according to their own instincts and priorities. But the particular dynamics of the late 1930s, an incarcerated boss still pulling strings from behind bars, an independent Harlem economy the downtown families couldn't fully absorb, a black neighborhood proving over and over that it could not be taken by force the way other territories had been, belonged to a specific and largely undocumented moment that survives today mostly in the stories people chose to keep telling. It is worth noting, too, that the Commission's restraint toward Harlem in the years following whatever happened in 1939 was never framed by anyone on the Commission's side as respect or acceptance. It was framed, to whatever extent later accounts and historians have been able to reconstruct Commission thinking at all, as a cost that had simply grown too high relative to the reward. This distinction matters because it explains why the peace between Harlem and the downtown families throughout the late 1930s and into the early 1940s remained so fragile, resting on calculation rather than trust, and why that fragile peace would eventually break down again a few years later into the more thoroughly documented conflict of 1943, when a new set of commission leaders decided the calculation might have changed enough to be worth testing once more. Bumpy Johnson would go on to face his own share of documented legal troubles in the years that followed, including federal narcotics convictions and stretches of imprisonment that are recorded in court files rather than passed down as legend. He would also go on to face another, better documented confrontation with the downtown families in the early 1940s, a conflict closer to the one this channel has covered before, involving direct commission pressure, economic warfare through police harassment, and an eventual uneasy resolution brokered with the help of figures from Harlem's own underworld history. Whether the 1939 warehouse story represents an earlier chapter of that same broader conflict, a separate and largely undocumented episode in its own right, or a piece of protective folklore that grew up around the very real tension between Luciano and Johnson, is a question that the surviving historical record simply cannot answer with certainty. Johnson lived until 1968, dying of a heart attack in a Harlem restaurant, by which point he had become something closer to a local institution than a fugitive figure, a man whose funeral reportedly drew thousands of Harlem residents who considered him, whatever his crimes, one of their own. In the decades since his death, Johnson's life has been revisited repeatedly in books, documentaries, and dramatized films and television series, each new retelling adding its own texture to a story that was already, even in his own lifetime, part historical record and part community legend. This continued fascination speaks to something beyond simple crime story entertainment. Johnson's life offers a way of examining how black communities in mid-century America built and defended economic institutions of their own, however illegal, in a system that offered them almost no legitimate alternative, and how those institutions could become sources of both real harm and real communal pride simultaneously. Every retelling of a story like the 1939 warehouse legend carries some piece of that larger tension forward, whether the storyteller intends it or not. What remains is the story itself, carried forward in the way so much of this era's history has been carried forward, through the people who lived alongside it and chose to keep it alive. 6 men went into Harlem, according to the story that has outlasted every other detail of that particular night. None of them came back. And whether that is a precise transcript of history or a piece of hard-won Harlem legend built around a very real and very dangerous man, it endures because it captures something the neighborhood needed to believe about itself in an era when very little else offered that same kind of protection. There is a reason storytellers keep returning to Bumpy Johnson, decade after decade, long after every direct witness to his life has passed away. His story sits at an intersection that few other figures from this era occupy quite as fully. A genuine criminal enterprise built inside a community, denied nearly every legitimate path to economic power, a personal defiance of forces that most people considered untouchable, and a legacy that Harlem itself chose to preserve, complicate, and pass forward on its own terms rather than leaving that job to outside historians alone. The 1939 warehouse story, whatever combination of fact and legend it ultimately represents, belongs to that larger tradition. It is not offered here as settled history. It is offered as a window into how a neighborhood remembered a man who mattered to it, and into how much of American organized crime history, especially the parts involving communities that official institutions long ignored, survives today only because people refuse to let it disappear. That, as much as any specific date or body count, is probably the truest part of the whole story.